And the thing is, brothers, is that I want to tell you about, you mentioned Abdeslam Zaif. He came here in 2010 to the UK. Most people don't actually know, but he came for a short visit, and he told me this amazing story. He said that General Petraeus turned up to his house in 2009 or something like that, after he'd been released from Guantanamo, and Petraeus was in charge of US forces in Afghanistan. Petraeus actually literally turned up at his door. He tried to call him a few times, and he just refused to take his call. So he turned up at the door with his own entourage, and he asked, "Can I come in and speak to you?" He said, "Can you please find me a way out of Afghanistan? I just need to negotiate. I need to negotiate with the Taliban." And Mullah Zaif's answer was just classic. He said, "I'm no longer part of the Taliban leadership, but I'll give you one advice. If you really want to talk to the Taliban, it's very easy. All you have to do is, you see those rockets that you fire every day at the Taliban? Just follow the trajectory of the rockets, and you'll find there the Taliban at the end waiting for you, ready to talk or fight."
Yeah.
And it's funny because I guess in the end that's what they did.
Yeah, that's what they did.
A couple of years belatedly, they followed Mullah Zaif's advice. I mean, you mentioned Guantanamo earlier, and I'm really glad you mentioned the 2014 release of the 5 Taliban prisoners for the US soldier Bo Bergdahl, right? And now those 5 Taliban members were quite senior officials in the movement. Khairullah Khairkhwa, Mullah Fazl Mazlumyar, and these guys were released in 2014, and they form quite a significant part of the negotiating team with the Americans. That's obviously culminated in this peace deal. As your fellow inmates, did you know these Taliban 5? Did you ever encounter them? What had you heard about them?
So I encountered them, but only for a short time. And that was in Kandahar when I was a prisoner there. After that, I didn't, because when I was in Guantanamo, I was completely in solitary confinement. I held away from other prisoners. I don't know what they thought. They thought I was worse. They thought I was more dangerous than the Taliban. I don't know why, but
you spoke English.
Yeah, because I speak English. As you know, is one of the most dangerous things in the world.
Yeah.
So the Taliban, so quite a few of these Taliban members were with you in Kandahar.
Yeah, they were in Kandahar. Yes, many of them were in Kandahar. We were in communal cells in Kandahar, and then from Kandahar to Guantanamo. And as I said, a lot of these leaders were kept with the other brothers in normal blocks, but I was put in solitary confinement. And
was that flattering, or was that flattering? How did that make you feel?
It made me feel isolated. Made me feel isolated. But the point was that showed that the Americans' view of the Taliban, though it is they regard them as whatever they regard them as, they understood that these guys were fighting occupiers. They understood that it's a normal thing. It's the most normal thing. Britain was about to be occupied by the Nazis during World War II, and they set up an entire program where ordinary citizens were going to be trained in Osterley Park how to use Molotov cocktails against Nazi occupiers, and they're taken over. It's the most normal thing. In fact, it's abnormal to say that occupation happens and somehow we're not going to fight the occupiers. That's not a British trait at all. If anything, it's very British to fight the occupier. Even though Britain is mostly occupied.
Yeah.
But,
that's one of the tales of the turns of history. In 1940, they were preparing for Nazi occupation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that the Americans recognized what they were. The only threat they faced from these people wasn't ISIS-style attacks carried out in the streets of Britain or bombing tubes. That was never and never has been the modus operandi of the Taliban or any of the Afghan Mujahideen. The only thing they were worried about is that these guys are going to come back home and fight us. And so they needed those very same people to help them get out the quagmire that they created for themselves. And so now if you look at it's amazing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how he changes the hearts in the situation. The very same people who were called the worst of the worst by the US administration, by Bush and others, now what does Trump say? The Taliban are good fighters. I respect them. Just ask the Soviets. Well, we don't want to ask the Soviets. We need to ask you. You were unable to defeat them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the sort of speaking about Britain's, the colonial sort of Britain preparing for occupation and then becoming the occupier, I think there's an element of colonial hangover that's also prevalent here, given that we had. You have the approach to the Taliban fighters, but a lot of these prisoners, like you said, were not Taliban, or they were from completely different political movements. So we had Malawi Hamdullah Tarakhil, who recently passed away in Afghanistan. He was not a member of the Taliban. He was a member of Hizb Islami. Sangar, was it Hizb Islami?
Yeah, I think so, yes.
Exactly. So this is the son of a very senior religious scholar from Sangar, is it?
Yeah, it's from our district, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, the fact that these guys fit the classic stereotype of wearing a turban or a funny hat and having a long flowing beard makes you the bad guy or makes you an extremist or fanatic. There is very much a colonial aspect to this. And that's obviously been translated quite devastatingly into a massive loss of life.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's absolutely completely correct. And if nothing else, and in Afghan, in communal Afghan history, everybody knows that the British launched 3 wars in Afghanistan, and in the last one, there was the famous battle that took place where over several weeks, where one person was left alive to go and tell the tale to the British king about what their incursions were. But there's a history of trying to occupy this region. There's the whole story of the Great Game and trying to stop the influence of Tsarist Russia getting into that region. But the thing is, Afghanistan, this landlocked country, which has natural resources, everybody else has been trying to vie for and fight to get those resources. The people have been impoverished for over 100 years by these great superpowers. But the sad and shocking thing for all of these powers is, did you never learn your lesson? And it needs to be told again and again and again, because what do you do to when you collectively try to destroy people like this? That's why the peace initiative is so important. And despite all of those reservations people have about the Taliban and their treatment of women, etc., peace is the most important thing for this country, and everything else will follow, inshallah.
Yeah. I think there's a famous story of one British Prime Minister. I think it was Harold Macmillan, and he was going. Don't quote me on this exactly, but he was going on holiday, or he was resigning, or giving power over transferring power to his deputy, and he said, "Oh my boy, as long as you don't try invading Afghanistan, everything will be fine. Don't worry about it."
This point about peace. Something that has been playing up in the last few days in Afghanistan is that there was a very horrific attack on a maternity ward of a hospital where in an area in Kabul where there are mainly Shia Afghans. So this attack, while it is not claimed by any group, is attributed to Taliban, because obviously they are considered as a Sunni jihadi movement, and because of the things that happened during the Taliban era. So people use this as a pretext to say, look, we shouldn't proceed with these peace initiatives because obviously the Taliban are behind this terrorist attack, and they have shown that they do not want peace. This is now being repeated by quite a few Western authors, journalists, people who have a lot of influence in Washington, because they think that the peace process should be stalled, or that the peace initiative shouldn't even have started because Taliban are evil. But on the other hand, what amazes me is that we have today a notorious general, a militia general from the communist era, who is accused of rape, raping another man, he is appointed as marshal as part of a political deal. So somehow it is okay for warlords, mass murderers, torturers, people who have basically, in Kabul, where I am from, when these warlords came to power, they kidnapped young women. They took them as war booty of people in Kabul. And these people are somehow accepted and whitewashed as Democrats and legitimate representatives of the people. But with the Taliban, they don't want to make peace. Somehow the Taliban are not good enough for peace. So what really bothers me about this is that you're not supposed to make peace with your friends. You're already friends. You're supposed to make peace with people who have actually fought you. So if we want to reach some sort of settlement in Afghanistan, all these different sides who all have blood on their hand, they need to somehow reach a settlement and make peace. If you don't do that, obviously either one side have to win and exterminate the other side, or vice versa. So it basically it means either you have continuous war in Afghanistan and killing, or you need to sit around the table and talk to each other. And this is something that needs to be facilitated. People, advocacy groups from around the world need to address this point, because too many influential figures, what they're doing, they're using their platform to say, no, we don't want to do peace with these guys. We just want peace with these criminals. It's just a point that is not being raised, and this needs to be raised, and this needs to be addressed.
I think this comes back to a theme with Moazzam's work as outreach director at CAGE. When we talk about the war on terror, this sort of thing is that the idea essentially has translated, right, into you can kill people, you can massacre people, you can commit war crimes, crimes against humanity, commit rape on an industrial scale, as long as you quote you do it in the name of an ideology that is not Sunni Islam. that is essentially
better than that.
Yeah, that is essentially going from Syria to Iraq to Afghanistan. That is the general trend that I see. So if a militiaman is doing it for the purpose of self-enrichment or aggrandizing his power, it's okay. If it's a Sunni Muslim quoting some sort of vague societal goal based on religion, it's not allowed. It's absolutely reprehensible.
It's terrorism.
And and this is the war on terror in a nutshell. And so when we speak about the current Afghan government, we're speaking about an entity that obviously uses the fact that Taliban may or may not, in varying shapes or forms, be supported by Pakistani intelligence or military. But at the same time, this government is the offspring of a very unholy union between a variety of warlords who destroyed Kabul 10 years before they came to power together, these warlords and the Americans. And it relies on the same narratives that the war on terror propagates. And speaking of the war on terror, if we just shoot out generally, the constituents of the axis of resistance, who are avowedly anti-American and anti-imperialist, even China with its treatment of the Uyghurs, they quote directly war on terror terminology. And this is something that we need to discuss and critique.
So look, brothers, I mean, one of the things, it's important that what did Hamidullah Tarakhel say just before he passed away? He said, look, I have been fighting occupiers. I fought the Soviets. I was imprisoned for fighting the Soviets. I was imprisoned. I spent 23 years in prison fighting 2 occupiers. And he said, but I am not averse to the idea of peace. I don't want vengeance. Now that's, he has the right to, after all that he's suffered.
Yes.
What I want for the country is peace. It's time for the Democrats for the Islamic parties, for the pro-communists to sit down together, to recognize their mistakes, to put their hands up, and to say, yes, we have blood on our hands, but we want to wash that blood off.
Yes.
And we to forgive and forget and move on for the sake of the country. Anybody who doesn't want to do that and wants to allow the foreign occupiers and the foreign control of Afghanistan to be their bargaining chip, then he said the Taliban was right in making sure that the first condition is that the foreign occupiers leave. The problem is that with this attack that took place recently, and I first of all, you have to say, I don't know what kind of human beings can go inside in a place where there's a maternity hospital and shoot, except that they want to destroy the peace process. So whoever did it...
In the month of Ramadan, nonetheless.
Yeah.
My personal belief is that I'm not surprised if ISIS did it, because Taliban have been fighting ISIS and for quite some time, and that they're trying to rear their head over there. But ISIS has always, as we know, been used as a kind of tool to attack everybody who resists. So I think it's important. The Taliban, first of all, Suhail Shaheen, the spokesman of the Taliban in the English world, openly and clearly said the Taliban condemned this attack. Now, you're not going to condemn something if you did it. Right? That doesn't make sense. And at the same time, there are reports, as I said, that other groups like ISIS may have been responsible, but whoever it is wants to make the breach. Taliban is very serious about the peace process. At the same time, they said if the occupation, Sheriff Abbas Zaid, he said that if they insist on the occupation, then we don't want war, but if we have to, we'll fight them until they leave.
Yeah.
So if there is a peace process and an initiative, the government of the day needs to recognize, whether you like it or not, whether you want to delegitimize them or not, they have been legitimized by your backers.
Yeah, exactly. I think